The house was quiet when Detective Carter arrived. The night had already fallen, and the shadows inside the mansion seemed to stretch unnaturally long. A low, chilling breeze swept through the half-open windows, carrying the faint scent of something burnt. There, in the center of the grand living room, lay the body of Greg Henderson. Blood stained the cream-colored rug beneath him, and his eyes stared lifelessly at the ceiling. But it wasn't the murder itself that made Detective Carter's heart race. It was the discovery of the evidence that followed. Lying next to Greg, almost too carefully placed, was a photograph. In it, a smiling couple stood close together, arms draped around each other in a way that suggested intimacy. The woman was Sarah, Greg's wife. The man beside her, his own brother, Mark. Carter couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was clear now that something dark was lurking beneath the surface of the Henderson family. The case had begun as a simple investigation into the murder of a husband. But now, Carter was facing the shocking realization that Greg's wife, Sarah, had been having an affair. Not just with anyone, but with her brother-in-law, Mark. It was a dangerous mix of betrayal and deception. As Carter examined the photograph more closely, he noticed something that made his pulse race. In the background of the photo, there was a subtle, strange reflection in the glass window. Someone was standing just out of view, watching. A cold chill ran down Carter's spine. He couldn't make out who it was, too blurry, but the figure was unmistakably there. What had happened in this house? Why was there a reflection in the window when the house was supposed to be empty? Carter shook off the unease and signaled for his team to gather the rest of the evidence. But he couldn't help but feel that there was more to the story than what the surface revealed. It didn't take long before the first questions arose. Who had killed Greg? Was it his wife? His brother? Or someone else entirely? Sarah had been taken into custody just hours earlier. She was visibly shaken, pale, and terrified. But her demeanor only deepened the mystery. Was she guilty? Or had she been caught in something far worse than she ever anticipated? Before Carter could fully process what was happening, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Detective, you need to see this," Officer Miller called from the other room. Carter rushed over, following Miller into the kitchen. On the counter was an open drawer, and inside it was a small journal. It looked ordinary enough at first glance, but as Carter flipped through the pages, his hands grew cold. The writing was unmistakable. It was Sarah's handwriting. The entries were filled with dates, times, and cryptic messages. Some entries described what seemed to be everyday activities, but others revealed a forbidden love affair between Sarah and Mark. There were even mentions of arguments between Greg and Mark, growing tension that no one had noticed. And at the very end of the journal, the words were bold and chilling. "It has to be done. He has to die. It's the only way we can be free." Carter stopped reading. He knew in that moment, Sarah was involved in something far deeper than simple infidelity. This was a plan, a conspiracy, and it was only just beginning to unravel. He could feel the weight of the journal in his hands, the confession hidden in those pages. But before he could delve deeper into the implications, he heard a loud crash from the living room. Carter ran back, his heart pounding in his chest. A figure was standing over Greg's body. Mark. Mark's face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief as he stared at the corpse. His hands were trembling, but his expression, it wasn't the look of a guilty man. It was more like the look of someone who had just found out something horrifying, something that he had been trying to avoid. What are you doing here?" Carter demanded, his voice firm. Mark turned slowly, his mouth opening as if he had forgotten how to speak. He was speechless, his mind clearly racing. I don't know. I came back to check on Sarah. I thought." Mark's voice cracked, and for a moment, he seemed like a lost child. Carter had no time for that. "You need to tell me everything. Now." But before Mark could respond, there was another crash. This time, it came from the hallway. Someone else was in the house, and they weren't supposed to be. Carter's mind was already running 1,000,000 miles a minute. Who was it? Was it another accomplice? Or someone else trying to cover their tracks? And how did this person know that Greg was dead? Could they have been the murderer? The sound of footsteps echoed through the halls, quick and hurried. The shadows stretched longer, and Carter felt the unmistakable sense that something terrible was about to happen, something he hadn't prepared for. The figure in the hallway stepped forward. It was Sarah. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide with fear. She held something in her hands, tightly clutched against her chest. Carter couldn't make it out at first, but as she stepped into the dim light, it became clear. She was holding a gun. "Stay back," Sarah cried out, her voice shaky but sharp. "I didn't want any of this. But now I have to finish what I started." Carter froze, realizing the danger they were all in. The tension in the room was palpable. Mark looked at Sarah with a confused expression, and Carter was left with no choice but to make a decision. What was Sarah going to do? What was the truth behind her shocking confession? And most importantly, who was really in control of the situation? The gun was pointed at the ground, but it was clear she could raise it at any moment. And then, just as the situation reached its breaking point, Sarah took one step forward, her face twisted with emotion. What happened next, no one could have expected. The tension in the room was suffocating. Sarah's hands gripped the gun so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She took a step forward, her face contorting with pain and fear. Mark, still in shock, backed away slowly, as though he was unsure whether to approach her or flee. Carter could feel his heart racing, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he tried to make sense of what was happening. "Sarah," Carter said calmly, trying to keep his voice steady, "put the gun down. This isn't the way to handle it." But Sarah shook her head fiercely, her eyes wild. "You don't understand," she cried. "You don't know what he did. What we both did." Her voice cracked, and she seemed to collapse inwardly, as if her entire world was falling apart. "I never wanted any of this. But it's too late now. He's gone, and there's no going back." Carter's mind was spinning. He had 1,000 questions, but one thing was clear. Sarah wasn't acting like a typical person in shock. She was acting as though she was already resigned to something dark and irreversible. Mark took another step back, his eyes darting between Sarah and the detective. He seemed like he wanted to say something, but his words wouldn't come out. His breath was shallow, and his face had turned a ghostly pale. It was obvious to Carter that Mark knew far more than he was letting on, but whether that meant he was guilty or just scared out of his mind, Carter couldn't be sure. "Tell me everything," Carter said, his voice becoming more authoritative. "Now, what's going on here? What happened to Greg?" Sarah's eyes flickered with guilt, but she didn't answer immediately. She just stared at the gun in her hands, as though the weight of it was unbearable. Her hands trembled more than ever. "I never meant to hurt him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Greg, he was a good man, but he was never enough. He never saw me. He never saw us, me and Mark." Carter's brain raced. "Us? What did she mean by that?" "We." Sarah stopped, tears spilling from her eyes as her voice broke. "We loved each other. We didn't want to, but it just happened. And once it started, it was impossible to stop." Carter narrowed his eyes, trying to piece together the web of lies and betrayal. "So you and Mark were having an affair," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "Is that it? Why did it lead to Greg's death? What's the connection?" There was a long, heavy silence. Mark finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. We just wanted to be together. We didn't want Greg to find out." Sarah looked at Mark, and for a moment, there was a brief moment of silent understanding between them. But then, just as quickly, her face hardened. "You don't understand," she snapped, her voice rising. "Greg was getting too close. He was starting to figure it out. He kept accusing Mark of something, of things he didn't do. He was going to ruin everything. We had to make him stop." Carter was taken aback. This wasn't just about an affair. There was more to it. "You're telling me you killed Greg because he was getting too suspicious?" Sarah nodded slowly, but it wasn't just guilt she was feeling. It was fear. Fear of something worse that was about to come. "We had no choice," she said, her voice trembling. "We tried to end it, but it was too late. Greg wouldn't leave us alone. He threatened us. He said he'd go to the police. He was going to ruin our lives." Mark remained silent, his face pale, but he didn't dispute her words. Carter felt his stomach drop. This was a murder born of desperation and deceit. But as much as Sarah was confessing, something still didn't sit right. She was too calm, too collected for someone who had just killed her husband. It wasn't just the affair that bothered her. It was something more. "Why did you think Greg was going to ruin everything?" Carter asked, his tone sharp. What else was going on? Sarah froze, and for a moment, it looked like she was about to say something important. But instead, she lowered her gaze to the floor. Her lips pressed together tightly, as though she were holding back the truth. I can't explain it," she whispered, looking almost defeated. Greg had changed. He was getting more paranoid. He started going through my things, my phone, my emails. He even went through Mark's things. He thought we were plotting against him. Carter's mind raced. Was Greg truly just paranoid? Or was he getting closer to uncovering something far darker than an affair? He needed more answers. But before he could ask another question, the sudden sound of a door slamming open echoed from upstairs. It was a loud, deafening noise, so sudden and jarring that it shook everyone in the room. Carter's hand instinctively went to his gun as he turned toward the stairs. Was it someone else in the house? Another intruder? "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady but urgent. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, a heavy, deliberate pace, came from the upper floor. Mark's eyes widened. "No, it can't be." Before Carter could react, the figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was Greg, alive. The figure at the top of the stairs was unmistakable. It was Greg Henderson. His disheveled hair was matted with sweat, his clothes were torn, and his face was bruised and bloodied. He looked as though he had just emerged from a nightmare. But he was alive. And in that moment, every shred of certainty Carter had felt about the case was shattered. Greg's eyes darted frantically around the room, landing on his wife, Sarah, and then on Mark. For a brief second, he seemed disoriented, like he couldn't fully comprehend the scene unfolding before him. "Greg?" Sarah gasped, her voice breaking. How are you?" Greg's voice came out hoarse, weak, as if he had been struggling to speak for hours. I couldn't let it happen," he muttered, stumbling down the stairs. His gaze shifted to Carter, and for the first time, there was a flicker of recognition. You're the detective. You have to stop them. You have to." Before Greg could finish his sentence, he collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud. Sarah screamed, rushing to his side. But Mark immediately grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Stay away from him," Mark shouted, his voice desperate. "He's not the same. He's not the Greg we knew." Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he rushed forward, kneeling beside Greg. Blood was dripping from his forehead, and his breathing was shallow. It was clear that Greg had been through something terrifying. But what? How had he survived whatever had happened to him? And why did Mark seem so terrified of him? "Greg, can you hear me?" Carter asked, trying to keep his voice calm, but his mind was racing. This was no longer a simple murder investigation. It was a twisted web of lies, betrayal, and something far more sinister. Greg's eyes flickered open for a brief moment, his pupils dilated and his skin pale. He stared at Carter with a haunted look in his eyes. "You have to listen," Greg rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't them. It was someone else. Someone who wanted to make it look like they did it." Carter leaned in closer, trying to make sense of Greg's words. Who are you talking about, Greg?" But before Greg could answer, he convulsed suddenly, his body jerking violently. Sarah screamed again, but this time, Carter could see the terror in her eyes. It wasn't just fear for her husband. It was fear for herself. Mark, too, seemed to be panicking. His eyes darted around the room, as if he was looking for an escape. "No, no, no, no," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. "This can't be happening." Carter pushed him away. "What's going on here, Mark? What aren't you telling me?" Mark opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, there was a loud bang. The sound of a gunshot. Everyone froze. Carter turned toward the source of the sound. From the corner of the room, a figure emerged. It was another man, tall, wearing a dark jacket and holding a gun in his hand. His face was cold, expressionless, as he leveled the weapon at Greg. "I told you not to come back," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "But you couldn't stay away, could you, Greg?" Greg's face twisted in recognition and terror. "No. You can't. You're dead. I saw you die." The man smirked, a cold, knowing smile. "You should have made sure of that, Greg. Now, you've made a mistake. This ends tonight." Before Carter could react, the man raised the gun again, aiming directly at Greg. "Get down," Carter shouted, pushing Sarah out of the way. But it was too late. The man fired. The sound of the gunshot was deafening. Everything seemed to slow down for a moment as Carter instinctively reached for his own gun, aiming at the assailant. But the bullet didn't strike Greg. Instead, it struck something else. Someone else? Mark. Mark's body jerked back violently, and he crumpled to the floor, the gunshot wound clearly fatal. His face twisted in shock and pain as he fell, his blood spilling onto the floor in a pool. The room was silent for a moment, except for the heavy breathing of everyone in the room. Sarah was in shock, her face pale as she looked down at her brother, who lay motionless on the floor. Greg, still weak but conscious, stared in disbelief at the body of his brother. Carter was frozen, his gun still raised, but now his mind was racing. The man who had just shot Mark was still standing there, his gun lowered slightly but ready to fire again if necessary. Carter could feel the weight of the moment settling over him like a dark cloud. The stranger looked at Carter and then at Sarah. "This is your fault," he said coldly. "If you'd stayed out of it, Mark would still be alive." "Who the hell are you?" Carter demanded, his voice sharp. He had no idea who this man was, but he knew one thing for sure. This was no ordinary criminal. This man had been involved in something far deeper than the affair or the murder of Greg. He was connected to something more dangerous. The stranger smiled, a cruel, twisted smile. "You don't need to know my name, detective, but you'll soon find out everything. You'll know who I am, and why this had to happen." With that, he turned and ran toward the back door, disappearing into the darkness of the night. Carter didn't hesitate. He bolted after him, but by the time he reached the door, the man was gone, vanished into the shadows. The house fell silent once more, the air thick with tension and confusion. Carter's mind was reeling. Who was that man? Why had he shot Mark? And most importantly, what was he involved in? "Detective." Sarah's voice broke through the silence, weak and trembling. What just happened? Who was he?" Carter didn't answer immediately. His mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened. There was too much at once. Too many unanswered questions. He turned to Sarah, his gaze hardening. "We're not done here, Sarah. Not by a long shot." But even as he spoke, Carter knew this case was spiraling out of control. Whoever the stranger was, he had just thrown a wrench into everything. And now, the hunt was on. The chaos in the house was overwhelming. Detective Carter stood in the middle of the living room, his mind whirling as he tried to make sense of everything. Greg was alive, but barely. Mark was dead, a victim of a gunshot from a stranger whose identity remained a mystery. And Sarah, though visibly shaken, was clinging to some semblance of composure as she knelt beside her brother's body, her tears staining her face. The police had arrived shortly after the gunshot, but by then, the man who had shot Mark had vanished. Carter couldn't help but feel the weight of failure on his shoulders. He had let the man escape. There was so much more to uncover, and yet, it seemed like every answer led to more questions. He took a deep breath and stepped closer to Sarah, who was still kneeling beside her brother's lifeless body. Her hands were trembling, and her sobs had quieted into muffled sniffles. Carter could see the anguish in her eyes, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her reaction than just grief. She had already proven that she was capable of hiding her true feelings. "Sarah," Carter said gently, crouching down beside her, "I need you to tell me everything. Who was that man? What did he mean when he said this was your fault?" Sarah's eyes flickered toward him, and for a brief moment, there was a flash of fear in her gaze. But she quickly masked it, turning her attention back to her brother's body. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, as though trying to steady herself. I don't know who he was, she said, her voice shaky but determined. I've never seen him before in my life, but I think he's connected to something much bigger than what's been happening here. Carter frowned. This wasn't the first time Sarah had said something cryptic. What do you mean by bigger? What are you talking about, Sarah? She hesitated for a long time, as if considering whether or not she should speak. Finally, she looked up at Carter, her eyes filled with an intensity he hadn't seen before. Greg was hiding something. He was afraid of something, someone, long before you or the police got involved. Mark and we didn't know the full extent of it until it was too late. Carter felt his stomach drop. Was this another layer to the story? Something that had been hidden for years? What exactly are you saying, Sarah? Was Greg in some kind of danger? She nodded slowly, her expression darkening. Greg had made some enemies. He didn't want me to know about it, but I found out anyway. He was involved in something illegal. And I think that man who just shot Mark? I think he was one of the people Greg owed. Carter's head spun. Illegal activities? Enemies? This was beginning to sound like something far beyond a simple case of domestic betrayal. But he needed to know more. What kind of enemies, Sarah? What was Greg involved in? She swallowed hard, her lips trembling. I don't know all the details, but I know that Greg was laundering money for a dangerous criminal syndicate. He promised me he would stop, that we would get out, but I don't think he ever really did. I think he kept it going in secret, even after he told me it was over. The words hit Carter like a ton of bricks. Money laundering? A criminal syndicate? This case had escalated in a way he never could have imagined. Sarah wasn't just an adulteress involved in a murder. She was now part of something far more complex and deadly. And Mark? Carter asked, his voice low and careful. Was he involved in this too? Sarah's face twisted with grief and guilt. Mark had no idea about the money laundering. He was a good man, detective. He didn't deserve any of this. Her voice broke as she spoke. But when Greg found out that someone was coming after him, he was too scared to tell me the full truth. He kept pushing us all away. He started acting paranoid, and that's when she stopped herself, taking a shaky breath. That's when I started the affair with Mark. We were both desperate to escape. But Greg kept saying that if we just lay low, everything would be fine. Carter felt his mind racing, trying to piece together the truth from Sarah's fragmented story. But it was clear now. Greg wasn't just a victim of betrayal. He had been living in constant fear of retribution from people who could end his life at any moment. And now, those people were coming for him, and for Sarah. Before Carter could ask more questions, the sound of a phone vibrating on the table interrupted the tension-filled silence. Sarah's phone. Sarah glanced at the phone, and for the first time, a look of pure panic flashed across her face. She reached for it with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the screen. Carter could see the name on the caller ID. It was a number she didn't recognize. Who is it? Carter asked, his voice tight with urgency. Whoever was calling now could be another threat. Sarah didn't answer at first. She just stared at the screen, her eyes wide with fear. Then, with a shaky breath, she swiped to answer the call. Hello? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. A voice on the other end of the line was too distorted to be clearly understood at first. But then, it cleared, and the words became unmistakable. We know where you are, Sarah, and we know what you did. If you want to keep breathing, you'll follow our instructions. Do exactly as we say, and you might make it out alive. Sarah went pale, dropping the phone to the table as though she had been electrocuted. She shook her head in disbelief. No, 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 she murmured, her eyes wide with horror. They found me. They found us. Carter's heart dropped into his stomach. He could feel the shift in the air. The stakes had just escalated to something far beyond the murder of Greg Henderson. There were powerful people behind this, dangerous people who wouldn't hesitate to kill to get what they wanted. Who was that? Carter demanded, his voice urgent. Who was trying to reach you, Sarah? Sarah's face was pale with fear. She couldn't answer. Instead, she looked down at her brother's body, her expression haunted. Do you think they're coming for you? Carter asked, a sinking feeling in his gut. He had no doubt now that this was all connected. Greg's death, the mysterious man who had shot Mark, and this new threat on the phone. It was all part of a much bigger, more dangerous game. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, "but I think it's too late to stop it now. We're all in too deep." And then, the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside the house echoed through the room. Carter's eyes narrowed. The worst was still to come. The screeching tires outside the house sent a shiver down Carter's spine. The situation had gone from bad to worse in a matter of minutes. First, a murder. Then, a shocking twist with Greg somehow alive. Now, Sarah was receiving a threatening call from someone who clearly had more power and influence than anyone Carter had encountered in his career. And now, there were people at the door. Whoever it was, they weren't here to chat. Carter's eyes darted toward the back door, and then to the windows. He couldn't risk letting anyone else escape, not with the stakes so high. There was no time to waste. He quickly drew his gun and motioned for Sarah to stay behind him. "Stay down," he said firmly, his voice steady, even though his mind was racing with questions. Who were these people? What did they want? And why were they targeting Sarah now, when things had already spiraled out of control? Sarah was trembling. Her hand clutched to her chest as she stared at him wide-eyed. "You think they're here for me?" she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "Stay quiet," Carter ordered again, his eyes scanning the house for the most defensible position. "We'll figure this out. But we have to be ready for anything." As Carter moved toward the front door, he could hear the faint sound of footsteps outside. The front porch creaked under the weight of heavy boots. They were close. His mind flashed back to the mysterious figure who had shot Mark. Could this be the same person? Or was there another threat? Were these the men Greg had been hiding from? Suddenly, the doorbell rang, loud and clear. But the sound didn't seem like a typical doorbell. It was almost as if it was a signal, a warning. Carter didn't hesitate. He pulled open a small window next to the door and peered outside. There, standing in the dim light of the porch, were two men. Both were tall, dressed in black suits. Their faces were obscured by the shadow of their hats, but Carter could tell they weren't here to talk. He quickly pulled back from the window and motioned for Sarah to stay in place. His instincts told him that these weren't ordinary law enforcement. They were something far more dangerous, something connected to the criminal syndicate Sarah had mentioned earlier. And they were here to finish what had been started. Carter approached the door carefully, placing his hand on the doorknob. He could feel his pulse quickening as he considered the best course of action. These men weren't going to give up easily. He needed to get the upper hand, fast. "Listen to me, Sarah," Carter said quietly, his voice just above a whisper. "I need you to stay hidden. Don't make a sound. No matter what happens." She nodded silently, fear in her eyes but understanding in her face. She moved toward the back room, her footsteps light on the wooden floor. Carter took a deep breath and opened the door slightly, just enough to speak with the men. He was prepared for anything, but as he glanced at their serious faces, he knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary confrontation. Before he could say a word, the man on the left, a tall figure with a clean-shaven face, spoke first. "Detective Carter, I was hoping we could talk. I'm afraid the situation has become complicated." The man's voice was smooth, calm, almost rehearsed. But there was a coldness to it that made Carter's skin crawl. "Who the hell are you?" Carter demanded, keeping his hand on his gun, though not pointing it directly at the men just yet. The other man, who had a slight scar over his left eyebrow, stepped forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Carter. "We're the ones who've been keeping an eye on Mrs. Henderson. We've been waiting for a long time to make our move. And now, you've made everything much more difficult, Detective." Carter's eyes narrowed. The truth was starting to fall into place. These men were no ordinary criminals. They were part of the same syndicate Sarah had mentioned, the ones Greg had been involved with. But how did they know about Carter? And what did they want with Sarah? "Where's Greg?" the first man asked, his voice calm but with an edge of warning. Carter stiffened, his hand tightening on the door. "He's still alive, and I'm not going to let you anywhere near him." The two men exchanged a quick glance, and Carter could see the flicker of annoyance in their eyes. It didn't take a detective to know that these were not people who took kindly to interference. The tension in the air grew thick as the silence stretched. One of the men, scarred face, as Carter had started mentally referring to him, smiled coldly. Greg has been more trouble than he's worth. But don't worry, detective. We're not here for him anymore. His eyes shifted toward the house behind Carter. We're here for her. Carter's heart skipped a beat. He knew exactly who they were talking about. Sarah, he said, keeping his voice steady despite the wave of panic creeping up his spine. You won't get anywhere near her. Not while I'm here. The man's smile widened, but it wasn't one of reassurance. It was the smile of someone who had already won. Oh, we'll see about that, he said softly. You're out of your depth, Carter. You've gotten involved in something much bigger than you can handle. The best thing you can do now is step aside. Carter didn't hesitate. He knew the only way out of this was to buy himself some time. But before he could make any move, he heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open behind him. Sarah. Detective, please, don't, she whispered, her voice shaking. She had stepped into the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. But there was something else, something Carter couldn't quite place. You don't know what you're dealing with. Carter turned to her quickly, trying to get her to step back inside the house. But before he could react, one of the men, the one with the scar, took a step toward her. It's too late for that, he said coldly, his voice filled with finality. You've already made your choice, Sarah. Now, it's time to pay the price. Carter's heart hammered in his chest. There was only one thing left to do now. Move, Sarah, he shouted, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her back into the house, even as the two men raised their guns in perfect sync. But just as Carter slammed the door behind them, a loud crack echoed through the air. A shot had been fired. The bullet shattered the front door with a deafening crack. Carter barely had time to react. He shoved Sarah behind him, his heart pounding in his chest as he scrambled for cover. The sound of the gunfire still rang in his ears, and the smell of splintered wood filled the room. He reached for his gun, but before he could aim, the two men outside began shouting instructions to each other, their voices cold and professional. Carter could hear their footsteps pounding against the porch as they repositioned themselves, trying to find a way into the house. We need to move fast, one of them shouted. We don't have time to waste. If they escape, we're done. Carter's pulse quickened. This was no longer just about stopping a murder. These men weren't just after Greg anymore. They were after Sarah, and by extension, Carter himself. He knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't let them inside. If they managed to get in, it would be over. Sarah, Carter said, his voice steady but urgent. Listen to me. You have to stay down. Stay quiet and stay hidden. I'll hold them off, but I need you to trust me. Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She nodded mutely, her hands trembling. But Carter could see that she wasn't just scared. There was something else. A deep fear of what was happening, but also a strange sense of resignation. As he turned to face the front door, Carter caught a glimpse of her, her eyes flickering between him and the door, and then, briefly, she looked down at the floor, almost as if she were lost in thought. Carter didn't have time to analyze it further. The men were closing in. He had to focus. He crept toward the living room window, taking care not to make a sound. He peered through the blinds, hoping to get a glimpse of their movements. Through the cracks, he could see the two men, their bodies silhouetted in the dim light of the street lamp. They were waiting, watching for an opening. They knew the house well. They weren't rushing. They were confident. The air inside the house felt thick with tension. Carter could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, but he also felt a creeping sense of dread. These men weren't just professional criminals. They were part of something much larger, something that had already claimed multiple lives, including Mark's, and now it was targeting Sarah. But why? Carter shook his head, forcing the questions to the back of his mind. Now was not the time to dwell on the why. The how was what mattered now. He needed to find a way to neutralize the threat. Fast. He glanced around the room, looking for anything he could use to fortify his position. There was a chair, a heavy wooden table, and a couple of lamps. Not much to work with, but it would have to do. Carter grabbed the table and shoved it in front of the window, hoping it would provide enough cover in case the men decided to fire through the glass. He then pulled the chair into the corner of the room, positioning it so that he could take cover if they tried to rush in through the door. The room was silent again. For a moment, Carter allowed himself to take a breath, listening for the sound of the men's movements outside. He could feel his heart thudding in his chest, the anticipation of what was coming almost unbearable. Suddenly, there was a loud bang as the door burst open. The two men stormed inside, their guns raised. Carter didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot rang out, but it didn't hit either of the men. They ducked, instinctively taking cover behind the couch. Carter had only moments before they would return fire, so he moved quickly, ducking low and rolling across the floor to the other side of the room. "Get out of the way!" one of the men shouted, his voice sharp with command. The sound of a second shot rang out, and the wall beside Carter cracked as the bullet skimmed past him. He didn't have much time. "Sarah!" he yelled, trying to keep his voice calm, even though his mind was racing. "Stay hidden. Don't come out unless I say so." But as he shouted her name, Carter realized something that made his stomach churn. He hadn't heard a sound from Sarah. Not a movement, not a breath. He turned his head quickly, but there was no sign of her. She wasn't behind him. She wasn't in the room. His heart skipped a beat as he pushed himself to his feet and looked around frantically. "Sarah!" he called again, his voice rising in panic. Then, he heard it. The sound of footsteps. Faint, but unmistakable. They were coming from the back of the house. They were coming toward him. Carter's heart raced as he quickly moved toward the back hallway. He could feel the air growing colder as his breath became shallow. He had to find her. He couldn't lose her now. "Sarah!" he shouted again, his voice frantic. His eyes scanned every corner of the house, but she was nowhere to be seen. The footsteps were getting closer, and Carter knew that whoever was moving toward him wasn't friendly. He took a deep breath and turned the corner into the kitchen. His gun was still gripped tightly in his hand, ready for anything. But what he saw made his blood run cold. Sarah stood in the middle of the room, facing a man he hadn't seen before. This man was different from the two who had come through the front door. He was older, taller, and had a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He wasn't holding a gun. He didn't need one. He was the one pulling the strings. "You're not making this easy, Sarah," the man said, his voice soft but filled with menace. "You've been very stubborn, but I'm afraid it's time for you to make a choice." Carter's mind raced. This man was the one behind everything, the one who had been orchestrating this whole mess. "Let her go," Carter said, his voice trembling with fury. "You don't want to do this." The man looked at him with an almost amused expression, as though Carter were nothing more than an annoyance. "It's too late for that," the man said, his lips curling into a smile. "Sarah here is already in too deep. She made her choice a long time ago." Carter's eyes locked on Sarah, who was standing frozen in place. Her face was pale, her body tense, but there was something else in her expression, something Carter hadn't seen before. It was a look of resignation. No, this couldn't be happening. Carter's heart skipped a beat as the man's words sank in. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Sarah had made a choice. But what choice had she made? "Sarah, please," Carter said, his voice breaking. "You don't have to do this. We can still get out of here. You don't have to be a part of this." But Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she took a slow step toward the man. And then, without a word, she nodded. And in that moment, Carter realized the truth. Sarah had known exactly what was going on all along. Carter's heart slammed in his chest as he watched Sarah's slow, deliberate movement toward the man. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The feeling of betrayal hit him like a wave. How had it come to this? Was Sarah really a part of this all along? Could everything he'd believed about her, about Greg, have been a lie? The man in the kitchen, tall, calm, and unervingly confident, watched Sarah with a knowing smile, as if this moment was something he had been anticipating for a long time. And Sarah, standing there, her hands trembling at her sides, her expression resigned but still distant. It wasn't the face of someone who was afraid. No, it was the face of someone who had already made a decision, a choice that Carter couldn't comprehend. "Sarah," Carter said, his voice hoarse with a mix of disbelief and desperation. "What are you doing? This isn't you. We can still fix this. We can stop them." But Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she turned her eyes to Carter, and for the briefest of moments, a flicker of something passed across her face, something that resembled guilt, but it was quickly gone, replaced by that coldness. Her lips parted, and she spoke in a low, controlled voice. "I'm sorry, Carter," she said, her words almost a whisper, "but I've already made my choice. There's no going back now." The words cut through him like a knife. No going back? What did that even mean? The Sarah he thought he knew, his ally, his confidant, was slipping away, leaving him with the chilling reality that she had been part of the very thing he had been trying to stop. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't even innocent. Carter felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't just about Greg or the murder of Mark. This was much deeper, more complicated. Sarah had been hiding something from him, something that had been building beneath the surface all along. The man in the kitchen stepped closer, his eyes now fixed on Carter. "I told you, detective. You've been chasing shadows. And now, look where it's gotten you." Carter took a step back, his gun still in his hand, but now it felt useless. His mind was spinning, trying to piece together the puzzle he had been handed. Sarah's involvement in all of this didn't make sense. But it had to. The truth had to make sense. Carter's instinct screamed at him that something was off, but right now, he couldn't afford to hesitate. Not when there was still a chance to salvage something. "You're not going to get away with this," Carter said, his voice rising with anger and frustration. "I don't care who you are or what you think you've won. I'll stop you." The man's smile widened, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was one of complete control. "You really don't understand, do you, Carter? It's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure the pieces fall into place. We've been pulling strings for a long time, and now it's too late for you to interfere." Carter's grip on his gun tightened, but before he could react, Sarah moved again, this time standing directly between him and the man. "I'm sorry," she said again, looking at Carter with empty eyes, "but this is the only way." Carter felt his breath catch in his throat. He wanted to reach out to her, to shake her, to make her understand what was happening. He couldn't lose her like this, not after everything they'd been through, not after everything he trusted her with. "Sarah," he pleaded, "don't do this. Please." But she didn't respond. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the man, and then nodded, as if everything had already been decided for her. The man smiled again, and then, to Carter's horror, he slowly raised his hand and pointed toward the door. "You've already lost, detective. I suggest you leave now. If you know what's good for you, you'll walk out that door and never look back." Carter's mind was still reeling, trying to process everything. The sudden realization that Sarah had been part of the syndicate all along felt like a punch to the gut. But what choice did he have? The man wasn't going to let him walk out. They were too powerful, too dangerous. "Leave, Carter," the man said again, his voice now colder, more threatening. "You've lost the game." Carter's gaze flicked from Sarah to the man, and then back to the gun in his hand. His pulse raced, adrenaline surging through his body. He had to act. He couldn't leave without answers. But would he be able to get the answers he needed? Would he be able to save Sarah? Or would it be too late? In a flash, Carter made a decision. He couldn't let these people control the narrative. He couldn't let Sarah walk away from this without understanding the consequences of her actions. Without thinking, Carter lunged forward. But before he could get close enough, the man's hand shot out, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her to the side. "Don't be foolish, detective," the man warned, his voice a low growl. "I won't hesitate to end this now." Carter froze. The threat was real. It was no longer just about stopping a crime. It was about survival. But he couldn't back down. "Not now. Sarah," Carter shouted one more time. "Tell me it's not too late. Tell me you haven't fully made your choice." For a split second, Sarah's eyes flickered toward him, a brief flash of something in her gaze. A brief glimpse of humanity. But then it was gone. She shook her head slowly, and her voice, when it came, was calm and almost detached. "I'm sorry, Carter," she said again, her words quiet but final. I've made my choice. You'll never understand." And with that, she turned her back on him completely. Carter felt a cold wave of disbelief wash over him. He had been betrayed. The woman he had trusted, the one he had fought to protect, was lost to him, and there was nothing he could do to save her. The man in the kitchen didn't waste any time. He stepped forward, his face hardening with determination. "You've had your chance," he said, his voice final. "Now, it's time for you to leave." Carter's grip on his gun tightened, but before he could raise it again, Sarah stepped between them. "No," she said quietly. "Let him go." The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing. But then he slowly lowered his weapon, his gaze never leaving Carter's. "You're lucky," he said, his voice low and cold. "Don't make us regret letting you go." Carter's heart was still pounding in his chest, his mind racing with the aftermath of what had just happened. There were no more words to say, no more arguments, no more questions. With a final glance at Sarah, Carter turned and walked toward the door, every step feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. But as he opened the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Carter stumbled out of the house, his legs shaky as he tried to process everything that had just happened. The door slammed shut behind him, and the moment he stepped onto the porch, he felt the weight of the cold night air hit him like a slap to the face. The street was eerily quiet, the dim light from the street lamp casting long shadows across the sidewalk. He stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space in front of him, struggling to understand what he had just witnessed. Sarah, his partner, his ally, the woman he thought he knew had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. She had made a choice to walk away from everything they had fought for, everything they had worked toward. She had chosen to side with the very people they had been hunting down. The thought gnawed at him, turning his stomach in knots. He couldn't understand it. Why had she done it? What had she really been involved in all along? Was it all an act? Was she always a part of this, and he had just been too blind to see it? He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white with the pressure. The anger bubbled up inside him, mingling with the fear and confusion that were still swirling in his mind. But what could he do? He had tried to save her. He had pleaded with her to make the right choice. And in the end, she had turned her back on him, on everything they had shared. Carter knew there was no going back. His only choice now was to keep moving forward, even if he didn't understand the full picture yet. He needed answers. He needed to know who was really behind everything, and why Sarah had been a part of it. But most importantly, he needed to stop them. He couldn't let them win. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His mind was still reeling from the events in the house, but he knew he had no time to waste. The men who had come after him were still out there, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. And if he didn't act fast, there was no telling how far this conspiracy went or who else might be in danger. Carter's hand brushed against his coat pocket, where his phone was still vibrating. He pulled it out, checking the screen. A message from his partner, Lisa, flashed on the screen. Her words were brief but filled with urgency. "We need to talk. It's bigger than we thought. Meet me at the office. Now." Carter's mind immediately clicked into action. Lisa had been investigating the syndicate from a different angle, but now it seemed everything was converging. She had information. Real, tangible information. And it was clear she had finally uncovered something important, something that might finally give him the answers he needed. Without hesitation, he slid his phone back into his pocket and started walking down the street, his steps quick and purposeful. He wasn't sure how much time he had left before things escalated even further, but he knew one thing for sure. The situation was growing more dangerous by the minute, and if he didn't move fast, he could lose everything. The drive to the office felt like it took an eternity. Carter's mind was on overdrive, replaying everything that had happened in the past few hours. Every word Sarah had said, every movement she had made. It was all starting to come together, but the pieces didn't quite fit. There was something off about it all, something he was missing. When he finally arrived at the police station, the building was dark, save for the glow of a single light in the corner office. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed through the door, the sharp scent of coffee and old paperwork hitting him as he stepped inside. Lisa was already there, her eyes scanning a stack of files on the desk. She didn't look up when he entered, but her voice broke the silence, sharp and filled with tension. "You're late," she said without looking up. "Had a little situation," Carter replied, his voice tight with frustration. Lisa finally looked up, her eyes narrowing as she took in his appearance. She could see the exhaustion in his face, the weight of the night's events clearly taking its toll on him. "I take it things didn't go well with Sarah?" Carter didn't answer at first. Instead, he walked over to the desk, leaning his hands on the edge as he looked down at the pile of files. "She's part of it," he said, his voice low and pained. "She's been involved in all of this from the start. She's working for them." Lisa didn't flinch. She had known something was wrong for a while now, but hearing Carter say it aloud still hit her like a punch to the gut. "So, it's true. She's been playing both sides." "Yeah," Carter replied, his jaw clenched. "And it's worse than we thought. She's not just a pawn in this game. She's an active player. She's made her choice, and it wasn't with us." Lisa let out a slow breath, her mind racing. She'd been digging into the syndicate for weeks now, but every lead had seemed to turn into a dead end. There had to be something, some piece of the puzzle, that would make all of this make sense. She wasn't sure how, but she knew it was out there, and they had to find it before it was too late. "Carter," Lisa began, her voice serious, "I've been looking into the connections you've mentioned. The syndicate, Sarah's involvement. There's more to this than just her. A lot more." Carter's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Lisa pulled a few files from the stack and slid them across the desk. "These," she said, pointing to the documents in front of him. "They're linked to some high-profile individuals. People who have been in the shadows of the city for years, running things from behind the scenes. I've found connections to multiple law enforcement officers, politicians, even people inside the FBI." Carter's stomach churned. He had suspected corruption, but this was something entirely different. It wasn't just a few bad apples. It was systemic, and it ran deep. "Are you saying there are people in our own department involved in this?" Carter asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "Not just our department," Lisa replied. "There are connections everywhere. People who have been feeding information to the syndicate, people who've been covering up crimes, pulling strings. The deeper I dig, the more I uncover. And it's all connected. It's like a web of corruption that spans this entire city." Carter's heart sank. The weight of the situation was beginning to hit him with full force. Sarah's betrayal wasn't just a personal blow. It was a glimpse into something much darker. They weren't just fighting against a group of criminals anymore. They were up against an entire network of powerful individuals who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. "We need to take this down," Carter said, his voice low and resolute. "We need to expose everyone involved, no matter how deep it goes. But we can't do it alone. We need to get to the heart of it before they silence us all." Lisa nodded, her expression grim. "I agree, but we're running out of time. The people behind this, they know we're getting close. We have to act fast." Carter didn't hesitate. He knew what had to be done. "Let's go. We can't waste any more time. If we don't stop them now, they'll come after us next." But as he stood up to leave, a chill ran down his spine. The feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by danger, had never been so real. They weren't just up against criminals anymore. They were up against a system that would protect itself at any cost. And Carter was about to find out just how far they were willing to go to keep their secrets buried. Carter's mind was spinning as he and Lisa made their way out of the police station. The weight of the information they had uncovered felt like a lead blanket pressing down on him. Corruption in the department, high-ranking officials tied to the syndicate, people he had trusted, people he had worked with for years. How could they be involved in something so vile? And more importantly, how had they managed to cover it all up for so long? His steps were quick, purposeful, but a dark cloud hung over him. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his instinct screaming at him that someone was watching. The feeling of being followed, of being hunted, was something he had grown used to in the last few days, but it was intensifying now. Whoever was behind this, whoever was pulling the strings, knew they were getting closer, and they weren't going to let it go without a fight. Lisa noticed the tension in Carter's movements, The way his eyes flicked from side to side, constantly on alert. She had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the signs. He was no longer just thinking about the case. He was thinking about his survival. "You okay?" Lisa asked, her voice low, almost lost in the night air. Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at her, his eyes dark with the realization of how deep this rabbit hole went. "I don't know," he finally said. "I don't know if I'm okay. Everything's falling apart. Sarah, the department. Hell, I'm not even sure who I can trust anymore." Lisa stayed quiet for a moment, letting the silence settle between them. She understood. This wasn't just a case anymore. This wasn't just about the syndicate. This was personal. "You can trust me, Carter," Lisa said, her voice steady. "We're in this together." Carter nodded, but it was a slow, uncertain gesture. His mind kept returning to Sarah, the look on her face when she had turned her back on him, the finality in her voice when she had said, "I've made my choice." What had happened to her? What had driven her to make that decision? And if she was involved in this, who else could be? They reached the car, and without another word, Carter slid into the driver's seat. Lisa followed suit, buckling her seatbelt with a practiced motion. The engine hummed to life, and they drove off into the night, the city's lights blurring past them. It was only a matter of time before they were fully entrenched in a battle against people who had everything to lose if their secrets came to light. The drive to their next destination was quiet. Carter's thoughts were running at full speed, mapping out their next move. He knew the clock was ticking. He had no idea how many people were involved in this operation, how high up it went, but he knew they had to act fast. "Where are we going?" Lisa asked, breaking the silence. "To the city archives," Carter replied, his voice flat. "I've been thinking about something that doesn't add up. If the syndicate has been operating this long, there has to be a paper trail. The department's records, confidential files, there has to be something we can use." Lisa looked at him, a bit taken aback. "You're thinking about breaking into the archives?" Carter's eyes never left the road. "We don't have a choice. The higher-ups are covering this up, but they can't cover everything. The records are public, but they've been buried. If we can get in, we might find something that ties everything together." Lisa hesitated. "It's risky, Carter. You know that, right?" He didn't respond at first. It wasn't like him to make reckless decisions, but he had no choice now. Every step they took was met with resistance. The closer they got to the truth, the more they were being pushed back. "I know," he said finally, "but it's the only option we have left." When they arrived at the city archives, Carter killed the engine and parked in the shadows. The building was old, its stone facade looming in the dark like a relic of a bygone era. The windows were dark, the doors locked, but Carter knew the layout. He had been here before, had seen the access points, the weaknesses in the security. Getting in would be challenging, but not impossible. "We need to move fast," Carter said, his voice low as he stepped out of the car. "I'll get the back door. You stay on the lookout." Lisa gave him a curt nod before stepping out and positioning herself across the street, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. Carter moved quickly, slipping into the shadows toward the rear of the building. He reached the back door and paused for a moment, listening for any sounds from inside. He pulled a small tool from his pocket, working quickly to disable the alarm system. After a few tense minutes, the door clicked open. "Carter," Lisa's voice crackled through his earpiece, "I've got movement. There's a car coming down the street. You've got about 2 minutes before they reach you." Carter's heart rate spiked. He knew they didn't have much time. He pushed the door open and slipped inside, the dim light of the hallway guiding his way. The archives were quiet, too quiet, but Carter's senses were heightened, his every nerve on edge. He moved quickly down the hall, following the layout in his mind. The records room was just ahead, but as he neared it, something caught his eye. A shadow, a figure moving at the far end of the corridor. Carter froze, his breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone. Without thinking, he crouched down, moving silently toward the figure. He didn't know who it was, but he knew he couldn't risk being spotted. The last thing they needed was to alert whoever was watching the archives. He reached the corner, peering around it cautiously. What he saw made his blood run cold. A man, dressed in a dark suit, his face hidden in the shadows, was standing at the entrance of the records room. His hand rested casually on the door handle, as if he were waiting for someone. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away, careful not to make a sound. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just a random security guard. He was too calm, too composed. And Carter had a feeling he wasn't here by accident. He checked his watch. Lisa had given him a 2-minute warning. That time was up. Carter had no choice. He had to act. With one final breath, he sprang into action. Carter's heart pounded as he moved swiftly, pressing his back against the wall to stay hidden. His mind raced with calculations. He couldn't afford to make any noise. The man by the records room door was still standing there, his posture too calm for Carter's liking. Whoever he wasn't just some random bystander. This was someone who knew exactly what was going on. Someone who was part of the plan to stop Carter from uncovering the truth. For a moment, Carter just stood there, his pulse hammering in his ears. He could hear the distant sound of the car Lisa had warned him about, its engine purring in the distance, signaling the approach of someone else who might be closing in on the archives. Time was running out, and if he didn't act now, this could be his last chance to get the answers he needed. He pulled the gun from his holster, the cold metal familiar in his hand. Stealth was his only option. He couldn't risk a firefight, not when there was so much at stake. He needed to get into the records room. But how? The man at the door was blocking his path, and if Carter made a move now, it would be too obvious. He took a deep breath, his mind still working furiously. He had one shot at this. He had to distract the man somehow, get him away from the door long enough for Carter to slip inside. Carter's eyes darted around the hallway, searching for something, anything, that could help him. And then he saw it. A small metal trash can, half full, sitting by the hallway entrance. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He stepped quietly toward the trash can, picking it up with slow, deliberate movements. His breath caught as he turned, positioning the trash can in the perfect spot, just beyond the edge of the corridor. A small push, and it would roll down the hall, creating a distraction loud enough to pull the man's attention away from the records room. Carter's hands were steady, his movements deliberate as he positioned the trash can. He had only one shot at this. With a quiet push, he sent the trash can rolling across the floor. It clattered noisily, bouncing off the walls as it made its way down the hall. The man at the door reacted instantly, turning toward the noise with a sharp jerk of his head, his hand already moving to his side to check his weapon. That was all Carter needed. In a flash, he darted toward the records room, slipping inside without making a sound. Once inside, Carter took a moment to collect himself. The room was dimly lit, rows of dusty filing cabinets stretching out before him. He knew exactly what he was looking for. He had to find the files on the department's involvement with the syndicate, the connections, the people, everything that could expose the corruption that had been festering beneath the surface for so long. He moved quickly, his eyes scanning the labels on the cabinets, searching for the right one. His fingers skimmed over the metal handles, and he froze when he found it. The file labeled Case Number 2057, High-Level Corruption, in bold, black letters. His heart skipped a beat. This was it. He pulled the file open, flipping through the pages. The information inside was a minefield. Names of officials, agents, and politicians all tied to the syndicate, each one more dangerous than the last. But what caught Carter's eye was a name he hadn't expected to see. Sarah, he muttered under his breath. There it was, her name in black and white, stamped next to a list of transactions. Payments made from the syndicate to her under an alias, with details of her involvement in several illegal operations. Carter's hands trembled as he read through the document. Sarah had been working for the syndicate, but it was worse than he had imagined. She hadn't just been a bystander. She had been an active participant in their operations, directly involved in covering up their tracks, feeding them information, even helping them plan hits. It was a level of betrayal he couldn't wrap his mind around. A sudden noise broke his focus, a faint shuffle of footsteps down the hall. The man had heard the clatter of the trash can, but now he was heading back toward the records room. Carter knew he had little time left. He shoved the file back into the cabinet and quickly moved toward the window at the far end of the room. It was small, but he knew he could make it. Just as he was about to push the window open, the door to the records room slammed against the wall. The man had arrived. Carter didn't waste a second. He jumped through the window, landing heavily on the grass below. He rolled to the ground, his body sore from the impact, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He scrambled to his feet and bolted toward the parking lot, his heart pounding in his chest. Behind him, the door to the records room creaked open, and Carter heard the shout of the man, followed by the sound of footsteps chasing after him. His body screamed at him to run faster, but he pushed through the pain. He could hear the man closing the distance, the sound of footsteps growing louder with every passing second. He dove into the car, slamming the door shut just as the man reached the parking lot. The engine roared to life, and Carter slammed his foot on the gas, throwing the car into gear. He sped off into the night, not looking back. Lisa was waiting for him, her eyes wide with concern when he pulled up next to her. "What happened? Did you get it?" she asked urgently. Carter didn't answer at first. He was breathing heavily, his mind still reeling from what he had just uncovered. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the file, tossing it onto the passenger seat. "I got it," he said hoarsely, "and you won't believe who's behind it." Lisa's eyes widened as she opened the file, scanning through the documents. "Sarah," she muttered, her voice filled with disbelief. "She's been working with them all along?" Carter nodded grimly. "She's deeper into this than we ever knew. And I don't know how, but she's involved in every part of this, every crime, every cover-up." They both sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the truth settling in. Sarah had betrayed them both, but the deeper they dug, the more they realized how much bigger this conspiracy was. The syndicate wasn't just a few criminals trying to stay under the radar. It was a well-organized, deeply entrenched network that had infiltrated every level of authority. People they once thought they could trust were now the enemy. Carter's eyes hardened as he stared at the road ahead. "We have to stop them, Lisa. We have to take them down, before they destroy everything." But just as he spoke those words, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his eyes scanning the message. His stomach sank. It was from an unknown number. "You've seen too much. Now, you'll pay the price." Carter felt the blood drain from his face. He had no doubt that this was just the beginning. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "They know we're onto them. It's not over." Lisa looked at him, fear and determination in her eyes. "We're in this together, Carter. Let's finish it." Carter didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was already racing, thinking of the next step, the next move. The game had changed, and now it was a fight for their lives. As the car sped into the night, Carter realized just how far he was willing to go to uncover the truth, and just how much he was willing to risk to stop the people behind it all. But deep down, he knew one thing. The worst was yet to come.